How far back?
Let's get started, everyone. So it's my pleasure to introduce this week's energy seminar speaker. Drew Bohan is the Executive Director of the California Energy Commission. As everyone in this room knows, it's the state's primary energy policy and planning agency, including responsibilities of advancing state energy policy, achieving energy efficiency, certifying thermal power plants, investing in energy innovation, transforming transportation, developing renewable energy, and preparing for energy emergencies. Bohan has served California for more than 15 years. His public service includes leadership roles with the Energy Commission, California EPA, the Ocean Protection Council, and the California Department of Conservation. He's also served as Executive Director of Santa Barbara Channel Keeper, Chief Counsel to the House of Delegates in the Republic of Palau. It's kind of interesting. And a litigation attorney at Heller Ehrman in San Francisco. And now he lives in Carmichael with his wife Angela and their 2 children. And he's an avid bike rider, so you're in the right town, I think, for that. All right. Thanks very much. Come.
Thank you. Should we turn it down a little? Is this working? Is that about the right sound? Okay, great. Don't want to be too loud. Well, thank you all for having me. This is a nice way to spend a Friday. I just made somebody a job offer yesterday, and they said they wanted to sit on it for a day, and they just came in this morning and said they will take it. So I'm in a very, very good mood. This is going to be a great addition to our team. So I thought Ben suggested I'd sort of go through some slides and talk a little bit about what we do and why we do it, and then maybe save a few minutes and chat about my background, and if anyone's interested in thoughts on, if you're interested in public service, how you might navigate that, and that sort of thing. So I set this presentation up with the idea of looking at something that I think is really important from a public policy perspective, and that is setting goals. So for the last years, we've had two really good leaders. I served under Arnold Schwarzenegger for 4 years and walked in and saw his picture and was reminded of some of the things we did. And he really did, I think, an awful lot to advance the goals that we're really interested in at the Energy Commission. And I think probably a lot of you are here as well. And then for 8 years, Governor Brown has just done, I think, a remarkable job of taking things a step further. And a lot of that has started with just setting big goals. So when Arnold set some early goals, I got to see firsthand the power of somebody in that place setting goals, and how just doing that, just doing executive orders, it was enough to get people thinking about things, get markets moving, start getting a narrative going, and I found it really powerful. And again, I think Governor Brown has just done a tremendous job since then. So I'm going to march through things through that lens of goals. I've got about 40 slides, but most of them they're picture heavy. I don't like narrative slides, so I will go through them quickly. This is just the suite of bosses I report to, our chair, Chair Weisenmiller, and then each of the others, some of whom you probably know because they've either spoken here or you just know about their histories. And they're the ones who set all the policies for the Energy Commission. My job is just to try to do my best to implement. So this is my, I guess you could say, thesis. And I want to start off with climate change and greenhouse gases. You're probably familiar with these goals, but these are the big ones. We started off looking at trying to get down to 1990 levels. That seemed pretty doable as time went by, and that was AB 32, and I think that was 2006. And then we got to SB 32, which set targets for 2030, and now we're roaring ahead with trying to reduce to 80% below 1990 levels by 2050. So a lot of people, when I talk about these things, I see rolled eyes, particularly to various groups, and some of these things seem a little nuts. The governor signed an executive order on aiming for an entirely carbon neutral economy by 2045. And people, I spoke to a natural gas industry group, and I could tell and then the questions were fairly obvious that they thought that was just impossible, it was madness. But if you look back 20 years and say, when we had functionally 0% of our energy coming from renewables, to say we've got a third of it today, it's pretty remarkable in fewer than 20 years. So what seem like crazy goals, I think if you look at history, particularly in this area where our technology is just moving so rapidly, I think they're doable. Again, you guys, a lot of what I'm going to show you probably know, but I wanted to just highlight GHG sources. Transportation is really where we've got a lot of work to do. I know the neighboring office focuses on that. We use 50% attributable to transportation. This carves it out sectorally, and it's the way it was done for a particular purpose. But if you add in refining, which is pretty fairly attributable to transportation, you get to just about 50. So half of all of our GHGs are from transportation. If we don't fix that, if we don't do better by transportation, we're not going to come anywhere close to meeting our goals. A little bit about Governor Brown's under 2 MOU. Has anyone heard of this? Few people? Okay, and I know you would have heard of it. So a couple years ago, Governor Brown met with a German counterpart, and they cooked up this idea to try to get subnational governments to sign on to make a bold pledge. And we had Paris shortly thereafter. Some attribute that early narrative to supporting the ultimate goals that came out of the Paris Agreement. We've obviously seen at the federal level things have gone south if you're interested in dealing with climate. But if you look at this under 2 MOU, it all the signatories are pledging to take actions that work for their local jurisdictions to reduce warming to 2 degrees Celsius by 2100. And there's other metrics, but that's really the big one. And here's where we are. We've got 220 plus jurisdictions currently signed on. Again, these are subnational. They represent collectively 1.4 billion people and about 40% of the world GDP. So we've got a lot of the major players saying, we don't care what's happening at the US national level. We're going to do these things because we think they're in our interest and we think they're in the interest of the big ball we all live on. A little bit about what's been happening. And, you know, the scientists among us can quarrel about cause and effect. But if you just look at the last 14 years, this slide's a little bit dated. Our GDP's been going steadily up, a little dip, but it's been going up. It's tracking population also going up. At the same time, absolute GHG emissions going down. Economy doing well, population growing, GHG emissions going down, and per capita emissions going down even faster. Again, this is a very doable problem. We've been able to do it with what I think we'll look back on in 20 years as really rudimentary tools. Also, I want to encourage folks to just raise your hand, holler out questions if you have them as I go along. I see, yeah, take me up on it. Yeah, you bet.
There's one more.
Oh, that's good.
And then we see emissions and
Yeah, right.
GDP per capita.
Yeah.
I don't know if it would change the story at all.
Yeah, I guess if population were flat, GDP per capita would be going up even higher. If it's going up relative, yeah, don't know. Good point. All right, anything else? Please interrupt. All right, so I want to talk, I kind of pulled these together a little hastily, so forgive me if there's a little bit of jumble, but, and this is weird because it shows me this slide and then the next slide, so I've got to know which one's which. So I want to just talk a little bit about some of the big issues that are driving state policy leaders to really try to deal with the climate issues seriously. And fires is a big one. Sea level rise is probably the other big one that people can visualize, and it gets a lot of attention. 16 of the 20 worst fires in recorded history, which for California is 1932, have happened in the last 20 years. And the top 2 were in just this last year. So this is getting, the new normal is getting to be problematic. The costs are extravagant just for what the Energy Commission focuses on. This is T&D's transmission and distribution, $700 million just in burning down power lines, basically, and substations. So this is a massive cost in addition to being a tragic loss of life and other things we care about. EPIC is one of our programs. I'm going to talk a little bit about it towards the end. It's a program that puts about $150 million a year of public money into research. And we're looking at all manner of things across the energy spectrum. One of them is fires, and we're going to put a little bit more money into focusing on how we can avoid some of the problems we've got with fires.
Do we have any feel for what the impact of the fires here on
That's a good question. I've heard the metric, but I couldn't repeat it to you right now, that one of the big fires itself contributes, it's usually measured in vehicles or some part of the California economy. It's pretty significant. So yeah, it's a sort of a reinforcing effect as well. But I don't have the exact number. Right. So a big fire wipes out all the good work we've done for the last whatever period of time. Yeah.
that's an entirely different
It's true.
set of
It's true. I think those issues get pretty complicated because the good news is if we manage forests properly, they should be able to grow back, and so that shouldn't be a net over time loss. It should neutralize itself, but it's certainly a short-term hit.
fire load, the potential fire load that's up there because we haven't been to the control for it for years.
Yeah.
Big fires like we had this year. So there are places where because of the disease on the trees and such, there are 10 feet of dead trees laying down in the property.
right, on that cheery note. Another way of illustrating it, this is just an over time sequence of the extent of the burn, and expectations are it's just going to get worse, and really underscores your point. There's lots of causes, and that's one of them. And I like this quote from our former president. First generation to feel the effect of climate change, and the last one, a lot of us, I do this job, I wake up every day motivated to think my two little ones, I can hopefully be contributing something to this problem, but we got the tools, we got the time to get it right. I love this slide. I don't know if you guys have seen it, I'll just let you read it. So to those who would attribute this whole thing to a hoax perpetrated by the Chinese, okay, so what? Not such bad outcomes, even if that's the case. All right, let me move through just a couple of the other specific goals. So I'm going to talk about renewable energy, about energy efficiency, and about transportation, and then a final piece on research. But I thought I'd take each of the big ones one at a time. So these are our goals. 60% renewable generation by 2030. Again, if you'd have said that 20 years ago, they'd have said you're as nuts as saying we'd have a third right now. So basically we need to double where we are today by 2030. And this, I wouldn't say it's simple, but our analysis suggests we're pretty much on track to do that. This is doable. You probably heard about some of the problems of overgeneration. We've got so much solar in the middle of the day that we sometimes have to curtail it and then not utilize it, and it's a tragic waste. But I would characterize that as in the good problem to have category. It is a problem. It's something we've got to look at, but we're figuring out ways to deal with it, whether it's storage, whether it's shipping some of that power off to other states and then getting it back later in the day. I think as problems go, a pretty good one. And then I already mentioned Governor Brown's executive order, which doesn't bind anybody other than state agencies. So the Energy Commission is bound by some of the provisions in the executive order. But again, my experience has been putting that stake in the ground. It generates conversations, obviously in the state, beyond the state, in this country, and throughout the world. So I think it's really exciting that we now have this target. And one of our jobs as the Energy Commission is now to try to deconstruct that and say, all right, well, how do you do that? And natural gas is obviously a really big one. How are we going to change our economy to either get a lot of the gas as renewable gas, which is a real challenge, or shifting from gas to electric, which is then renewably generated. But I find these to be exciting challenges. So this is what California we're hoping in the next 30 years is going to look like. Something just went funny. Sorry. Oh, I think I've got like an animated slide. I'm not too good at this. All right, so one policy piece the Energy Commission did is we adopt building standards. And so this building was built pursuant to all manner of codes for fire and earthquake safety and all that sort of stuff. The Energy Commission adds a layer, and we call it Title 24, which refers to the code section where the rules exist, that requires that buildings be built to a certain standard. Does everybody know this? All right, I'm getting a lot of nodded heads. In any event, the latest iteration, we do cycles about every 3 years, added this requirement that all new homes have to have solar on them, with some exceptions for various regions and that sort of thing. And what was interesting is we had groups like NRDC and the Sierra Club raise their hand and be supportive, and that wouldn't necessarily be surprising to folks. But we also had the Building Industry Association that stood up and appeared and wrote letters and appeared at our hearings and said, we think this is a good idea, we support this. It's not common that industry says, we think it's a good idea that the government imposes obligations on us that we must do or get penalized if we don't, and yet the Building Industry Association did that. I worked closely with them when I was working in Governor Schwarzenegger's office on the solar plan, and I was working with some of the exact same players, the same institution, and let's just say they've changed over the last 10 or 12 years because they were viscerally opposed to the idea of any sort of mandatory solar requirement. Again, fast forward just a decade, and now they're saying we think it's a good thing, and it's probably largely driven by their big members that say, hey, customers like this. It'll help to even out the playing field if we all have to do it, and we think we can do it better and cheaper than our competitors, so, we welcome it. I think this is one of those that okay, so this is just showing the yellow line is what in 2004, I think it was, the EIA, the Energy Information Agency, I think that's right. What's that? Administration, thank you. This was their annual energy outlook. This is what they saw the solar curve looking like in the coming years, and it went crazy. So this is U.S.-wide, but this is an inspiring stat. I stole this from somebody. I thought it was cute. You look through here, and in 1900, see if you can find out where the first car is, and these are all horse-drawn buggies, except for that one. Then you fast forward in a decade, 13 years, it's all cars, same stretch, except there's a little horse up in the, way up there. So I think we're seeing this today, the rapid change, and obviously technology is able to make things move more quickly than some of the physical stuff with vehicles on the road. But this inspires me to think we can get these things done. I won't go into this into detail, but one of our commissioners in particular is very heavily involved in an effort with one of the federal agencies, the BOEM, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, looking at offshore, how can we use the wind resource that's there to create renewable energy through wind. And this picture is Central California. This is Morro Bay down here, which is attractive because the nuclear power plant that's going to go offline in 2024 has got all the infrastructure to take power coming off the ocean and feed it into the grid. Similarly, up at Moss Landing, we've got power plants that provide the same thing. The better resource, though, these are showing wind speeds, and the darkest it gets here, the best color for wind is probably about 9. I think this is meters per second. I confess I'm not sure exactly what the metric is. In any event, if you go up north, which is another area that this group is working on, the wind speeds are much, much higher, so the resource is much more attractive. However, there's no load up in the North Coast to speak of, and there's no infrastructure to move the power from, you can get it from the ocean to the shore relatively easily, but then to move it there to anywhere else in the state or onto the grid is a serious and expensive undertaking. So it's interesting. We've got one modest resource, but it's more ready to go, and it's got the infrastructure to take the power, and then a great resource, but lots of limitations. The military likes this area a whole lot less, and the Navy is really one of the key players involved in this, and they just see all sorts of problems with a lot of the activities they do. Vandenberg Air Force Base is right down here. You might have seen the news recently about they launched a missile, and people could see it from here. I missed it, but it looked pretty neat. So this has got a lot of conflicts. Northern California, far fewer. We also regulate, in addition to buildings, appliances. So this computer, assuming it's a recent vintage, was had to be sold legally in California, had to meet our appliance standards. So we look at things in computers like standby power and sleep mode, and we found, my God, these things are just eating energy when nobody cares and nobody needs them. So we adopted a rule that says, well, you got to put certain. You got to meet certain standards. Industry, you go figure it out. You've got multiple ways of doing that. You can do it through software. You can do it through hardware. That's up to you. Here's the standard you've got to meet. As a consequence, we've saved Californians, and I'll get to a slide on that, a ton of money with computers. This one's a really good illustration because it's I'm totally talking about the wrong thing, but save that thought. I'm going to illustrate a refrigerator that goes through this. This process. So when I did this in my office, I didn't do it like slide by slide, so my apologies. I'm just going to click through all these. Basically what this shows is these technologies, land-based wind, PV, both at utility and distributed scale, batteries and LEDs have all plummeted in cost since 2008. This has been one of the reasons that we've been able to meet some of these goals relatively painlessly. So far, and if you looked at the outer trajectory, they're still aiming to go, way down. So again, cause for optimism. This here just shows California is a leader, but the rest of the U.S. is particularly seeing wind as an attractive resource. So this was, I believe, calendar year 16. Renewables dominated. Fossil, much smaller, and nuclear, trivial. And the reverse of it is the retirement's almost all fossil. So again, I think this is moving us in the right direction. And this is just an interesting slide. One of the criticisms we get sometimes is, yeah, solar's great, but why do I have to pay for the other guy to get solar? How come we're giving all these government subsidies to these technologies? And this is really kind of the response to that. So if you look at the depletion allowance, it's been around for coming on 100 years. It's been putting in billions of dollars into oil and gas, and it's been a pretty big subsidy, and it's showing no signs of sunsetting. Compare that to the investment tax credit, which helps support renewables, or the production tax credit. One's been around for about a little better than 10 years, and one's coming on about 15. Each set to expire. And if you just compare the two, the subsidies of the two they're really trivial. And we've seen in California the subsidies that we put into solar for DG, distributed generation, it's driven the cost down. Now you can buy a home with solar on it, and you'll make more money on day one from your savings on your bill than you will managing whatever extra mortgage you have for the cost to buy down what you got on your roof. So subsidies really worked. If there's a success stories with subsidies, I would say solar in California is a really good one. Wall Street's obviously being impacted by this as well. If you look back, what is that, getting on 40 years. The big players, these are the biggest companies in America. GM, IBM, ExxonMobil, Ford, et cetera. Names we all are familiar with. Didn't change a lot over the first 20 years. You fast forward to today, and you've got, you've got one ExxonMobil, one oil company in our top companies. So this is good for business as well. And we've got some big players that have said, we're gonna do what may not be entirely cost effective today, and just aim for 100% renewables and try to make our little company economy run entirely on renewable energy. This kind of leadership is breathtaking, I think. Now, move to efficiency, and alluded to the buildings earlier, but these are some of the things we're working on at the Energy Commission. This is the solar requirement I mentioned before, and this just gets into a little bit of detail. Savings we expect over 30 years is $19,000 in reduced power bills. Obviously, we had to make some estimates about increased power costs over the years and that sort of thing. And the investment is $9,500 first cost to put the solar on your roof. So again, day one, you're cash positive. Now you've got an increased mortgage, and in fairness, that does. Not all banks recognize this and say, oh, we'll give you credit for the fact that you'll be able to pay us back better because you'll be saving on your energy. And in those cases, there are leases that people can get, and they don't have to put any money up front, but they just pay a lease fee every month. It squeezes the savings. The savings aren't as good as if you buy it outright, but you still end up being cash positive even with a lease. Well, what we require is 2.8 kilowatts. That's the system size. That's not going to be enough to serve all the load of most homes that it goes on. It'll serve part of the load. And that's just the minimum requirement, so home builders can size it as they wish. But we chose that number for a couple of reasons. It keeps the cost modest. Again, people can increase however they wish. It also reduces that impact of overgen by having it sized a little bit closer to accommodating even a very frugal energy user's load. So that's our requirement, just under 3. It does. It contemplates NEM continuing, and I'm not sure exactly the assumptions we built in terms of what changes are likely to occur. PUC is going to be entertaining that in the next year or so and looking at, should we be allowing the utilities we manage, the PUC manages the big 3 and a bunch of smaller ones, to what extent should we allow them to impose charges on ratepayers that have solar? And so they're exploring that, but we made a number of assumptions, and even under, there's a bill that I think basically says UPUC can't impose a rule that would allow utilities to charge so much that those who have solar end up losing. So we kind of balanced that out and made a couple suppositions and arrived at that number. You have a question?
I was just wondering, is this also applicable to commercial buildings?
No,
Okay.
no,
Is
just,
that something that you guys are thinking of? It seems like that's where a lot of
yeah,
energy loads are.
yeah, exactly. That's maybe the next step. I'm not the policy guy, but our policy folks are looking at that. But this was kind of a first foot in the door, and I think it's certainly on the table. Yeah.
Increase the number?
We
Where do we find that information? Because I haven't seen it.
If you send me an email, I'll leave my email address here. I'll get you that information. We did factor in a maintenance cost over time. It's 2 cents, not sure per what unit, but we did factor in something to accommodate that. But I think the evidence is pretty good that this is going to lead to fewer of those problems and make improvements rather than the opposite. And the reason is, if you've got thousands of one-off builders that are each needing to make a relationship with a solar provider, with electricians, with the utilities and all that, you're probably going to have more errors than if you have production builders building 200 homes at a time, putting them in just like they do roofs and gutters and every other part of a building, making relationships that they need to be confident on are going to be durable and they're not going to get sued, making the relationships with the utilities and the local governments to assure that things are all done properly. So I think it may well lead to better rather than worse.
Seen both the federal government and the state of California make some assumptions about the life of maintenance requirements.
Mm-hmm.
I haven't been an expert.
But I'd like to talk to you afterwards, actually. All right, good. Good. Good.
Especially in April.
Good. Well, would totally welcome your observations on this, how we've done it here as well.
My caution there is make sure the numbers we're working with are real numbers, not numbers that some have picked out. I've seen too many of them where there's no data to show that they're wrong.
Got it. Thanks. Not much, really. Yeah, we don't get in our renewables division works really on the certification of power plants to make sure that a power plant meets the renewable legal requirements. So large hydro isn't allowed, for example, and if you're using wind or solar or geothermal, there are attributes you have to be qualified. So we do that, and then we verify on the back end that the utilities that are required by the law, by the RPS to procure, are doing so from the right certified institutions, and that their numbers are consistent with what the evidence shows. But we don't really do that too much. Yeah. Well, I'm not sure if I understood it exactly, but this does not include the option that you can select for storage. But you're asking, did we model what those costs, how they would factor in? I don't know. There is. There is.
We should talk about that after.
Okay. I took a tour of the Gigafactory in Sparks, Nevada, just east of Reno. I guess it was about a month ago, and it's pretty impressive what they're doing there. And it does suggest to a novice, when it comes to these kinds of things like me, that they're building an awful lot of this stuff, and they've got to be getting better, and it's got to be getting cheaper. And the aggregate data we have suggests that, but seeing this massive soon to be expanded even more massively, production suggests it. But right now, the economics aren't great for the homeowner, but I think they're far sight better than they were a couple of years ago, and a few years from now, they'll probably be something a lot of people will consider. Yeah, there's a group that we helped create called the Cool Roof Rating Council. I think they're based in Florida. One of my staff, I know, I sign off on travel to Florida periodically. And, you know, I got to confess, I don't think we have any cool roof requirements. I'm pretty sure. Is that right? Thank you. However, I think you can get points. Anybody know this? I don't know. So the way our system works is you can either say, I'm going to do 1 through 27 when I build this house, and if I do all those things, I'll meet the standards. But what most builders do is say, here's a menu, it's huge, but you can choose what you want, whatever works for your business model and so forth. I think cool roofs might be one of those that you can pick, and then that will lower your budget or you know, add to your meeting the goal. But we do a lot of work in the area. I'm just not quite sure where it now interfaces with our actual requirements. But again, all these questions, if I'm not answering well, and this would be a good example, please hit me up for it. I'll make sure we get the right staff getting back to you. Okay. Well, they're a pretty amazing savings, so they're a really good idea. But I can't say that the extent to which we require them.
We live in the same Davis, which is basically our forest, especially in the lower parts of the site. I have had a number of neighbors cut down their trees and put in PV in the first. Now they're not in the shading.
Mm-hmm.
And so, how do we deal with that? Where we convince people not to cut down their shade trees just to get PV?
That's a tough one. That's a real clash because it's a fair point. I mean, I think it's a net winner for those who do it from the perspective of purely energy, but you lose a lot of other attractive features of.
You lose it for that home. You lose it for the surroundings.
Yeah.
Everybody gets the shade.
Yeah. Well, the benefit of the tree is beyond shade. So that I saw a hand.
I've noticed like a lot of the
Yeah.
what about multifamilies? Because we have a lot of older multifamily dwellings that are going to have to be will have to be retrofitted or new construction. And there's kind of like there's a disconnect between the resident may not be able to want to improve something or have the income or something, but the person who owns the building isn't paying utility bills, so there's no incentive for them to get PV for energy savings or
That is a really excellent question. So we've historically focused on residential, and it's pretty much, you know, there it is, it's a house, and commercial, which can be a 60-story building, and haven't really focused on multifamily really specifically. One of the things we're working on right now is trying to, for this next code cycle, really focus on that group of buildings that have been not received as much focus. And you point to the split incentive challenge that has part of the problem where the landlord isn't paying the power bill, so he or she may not care about that as much as the renter who's paying for it. So that's one problem. Another one is these agreements that the landlords in a lot of housing deal with, particularly in the low-income housing, are extremely complicated. And if you're getting the money from the feds and even the state that helps support those activities, you're bound up in a lot of deed restrictions and other things that make it a real challenge. So we're trying to deconstruct that, get a better understanding of what all the variables are, figure out how to make it in the interest of whoever gets to make the decision that, hey, if you do all this stuff, you'll be able to attract renters, maybe you'll be able to charge a little bit more, trying to figure out what those variables are. We're going to vote next Wednesday on a staff proposal to adopt a report we call the CLIMB report, which is the low-income and multifamily buildings report looking at a lot of these issues and how do we break down some of these barriers. So it's a really timely question. Do you have a question? No? Yeah. There was. I think it is a challenging question because that was one of the rejoinders we got to this idea we were advancing that, hey, why isn't it more efficient to do it that way? And I think I can't speak for the policymakers that really made the judgment after a lot of considerations, but what we've said is we're going to consider that in this next code cycle. So if stakeholders want to come forward and say, hey, why don't you give us an exception and let us build, we got a parking lot like you've got here, why don't we put the solar there instead of putting it on building by building, because you need inverters for each one, and there's efficiencies and economies of scale by doing that. A lot of disadvantages too. I think one of the variables was, and this is what Governor Schwarzenegger was thinking about 15 years ago, if it just becomes normal with a lot of these businesses where you wouldn't build a house without a front door, if it becomes normal where you just wouldn't build a house without solar and the costs come down so much, and some of them are integrated into the roofs themselves, this will be a good thing for California and is exportable around the country. I don't know how much of that was a driver, but I think it might have been a variable, but certainly considering it, looking at community level. Anything else? All right, I'll move on. Well, this is the one I thought I was talking about before. So this is now looking at appliances. I won't repeat what I said, but this is just, I think, a pretty good illustration. So if you look here, Energy Commission came into being in 1975 when Ronald Reagan signed the bill that created the Energy Commission. Then Governor Brown, in his first stint, appointed the very first commissioners. But this line just shows energy use by refrigerators over time. So World War II, people increasingly bought them, and they just started using tons of energy as they got bigger. At that point, after that, we adopted standards, and if you look over time all the way to 2010, Energy Commission got all the way back down to about 1955 levels. So good thing, right? Another criticism we sometimes get is, yeah, but now people have to have lousy refrigerators. You're forcing people to, wear grass skirts and live the way they don't want to. They got to get smaller ones. But if you look at the price, and then you got to pay a lot more. Is another criticism. If you look at the price, and it's not just our standards that are driving this, but the price of refrigerators has come down, and it corresponds fairly roughly to the graph showing the energy decline. And then finally, is it making people have to buy little teeny refrigerators? Is that why we're getting all this savings? Answer, no. When the standards went into effect, the average size of a refrigerator is generally flat, going up a little bit. So it really hasn't cost anybody anything, and yet they've gotten all these benefits by paying a whole lot less to operate their refrigerator. And of course, we benefit from the grid as well. Again, I'm not sure what all these things do. This is more of a aggregate look at how much money do these standards save. Not the individual who buys a TV that's a little less energy consumptive than had there not been standards. But when you add it all up, it ends up being real money. So our 09 TV standards, $1 billion. Chargers, I don't know, you may not remember, but chargers used to get kind of hot. You'd pull them out of the wall and they could be either warm or really hot. You might feel them still getting a little bit warm. They're not perfect, but they've gone way, way down. So that was a really simple fix. Put an off switch in. When the device is charged, turn off the charging. That's it. So, and by the way, I think it's had benefits too to the durability of devices because they're not being charged when they're full. And then another example here is just computer monitors. And again, we look at every, on sort of a cyclical basis, we look at the different things we can add to our list of appliances that we regulate. This is, I don't want to say that this is entirely attributable to our standards, but if you again look at when the Energy Commission started, we started putting in standards This is per capita electricity use throughout the country. U.S. basically been going up since 75, maybe trending down a little bit more recently. This ends at 2015. But if you look at the savings in the various sectors in California, at least a big contributor was the appliance and building standards that we've put in place. All right. Oh, that was just the last line. So California's in the blue, rest of the U.S. is in red. And again, I don't want to say that this is entirely caused by the standards, but it's certainly been a big contributor. And then nearly finally, I just want to talk a little bit about transportation. So here's some of the gee whiz stats with cars. So ZEVs, we're getting close to 500,000. And it's just about half of all the ZEVs in the United States. China, by contrast, is on track to add a little bit over 1 million in 2018. And it's increasing even faster. So lots to talk about with China. We've been doing a lot of work with China and some of the incentives that they have in place. Their government system enables them to employ techniques much quicker and much more thoroughly than we do, but just very different system. Chargers, we've got about 18,000 public. Google alone has, I think, at least hundreds, and Apple and some of these Silicon Valley leaders are really taking this to heart. But we've probably got close to 40,000 chargers now throughout the state, and then residential as well. If you add those up, it gets much higher. Hydrogen, we got 35 stations. It's pretty small, but it's growing. Got another 30 funded. Goals 200. Used to be 100. Goals now 200 hydrogen vehicles, and I think we got about 5,000 cars. Again, small, but if you look back to where EVs were early on, or even the Prius, had a pretty slow initial trajectory and then took off. We're hopeful this will do the same. And then, mentioned earlier, the GHG issue, and of course, transportation's a major contributor to lousy air throughout the state. This is just our projection that some of you know Siva Gunda used to go to this school, and Siva is running the unit that does forecasting for us, and he's fantastic, as a footnote. But this projection was done by his unit last year, and it just looks out to 2030. Where are we likely to be? Governor set a goal of 5 million vehicles. We want 5 million ZEVs by 2030. This shows us being a little bit shy on the high end of making that target. We're revising that now, and initial reports I'm getting are that the numbers look like they're going a little bit higher, but our job is to sort of step back. This unit steps back from the policy drivers and just says, what's our best, unbiased estimate. And I won't go through these in detail, but we get $100 million a year from the legislature that we invest in all manner of transportation activities. This is an example of heavy-duty demonstration where we're letting companies try out things. We made an investment in Proterra, one of the bus manufacturers located in the Bay Area. They were going to locate a factory and their headquarters in South Carolina. They decided to move it to California. They say it was directly attributable to a couple $1 million investment we made in the company to try to build these things. And if you look at the economics of a bus in a municipal situation in particular, and particularly ones with a high duty cycle, diesel bus versus electric bus, it's getting to be a no-brainer that buying the electric bus just makes a lot of sense. I went and took a tour and spoke at a Silicon Valley regional transit group, and the head of the operation was given a tour, and he said, we're finding on braking alone, we're saving, I don't remember the stats, but this phenomenal amount of braking, because it turns out braking from 60 to 30 is where most of the brake wear comes, and you use no brakes. You use no conventional brakes in an electric bus to get down to there. Then to actually stop, then the brakes actually engage, but that braking from 20 to 30 or whatever it is down to 0, he said, I didn't double check this, but uses a lot less braking force and wears the brakes out a lot less than that, trimming down from 60 to 30. So just on that alone, he talked about how with these electric motors, they can make the wheels spin at different speeds as they're making turns. He didn't have any numbers on it, but the tire wear attributable to using electric power versus diesel is good as well. So this is just an example of the kinds of things we fund. Another one in manufacturing, same thing. We've put in about half of all the chargers for EVs and all the hydrogen chargers. So I didn't put a slide up for that, but that's another piece of it. This is just a kind of a neat stat, I thought. I stole this from one of my bosses. Ford, 115 years old. They got up to be, a $50 billion company in a long time. And Tesla, did it relatively overnight. So this is, I think, what's this really fascinating merger of technology, public policy, and kind of get-rich-quick schemes all working together, and clever people is creating, I think, again, much cause for optimism. This is research. These are my last couple slides. I mentioned EPIC before. That's focused on electricity. The bulleted list just gives some ideas of the types of things that we focus on. And natural gas R&D is a little bit smaller. Together they're about 150 million, but these are the sorts of activities we look into. I mentioned earlier fires, and that would be coming out of this pot sort of over here. And this just gives a sense, some visuals. I think, is this you guys? Yeah, so, we were thrilled to be a part of investing in you guys and building such a forward-thinking set of buildings. Were you going to say something?
Yeah, on the last slide on the natural gas side,
Yeah.
given the pressing interest in
Yeah.
pressing for that. But given that importance, right, in our control, do you see kind of an interest in increasing the amount of R&D dollars going towards
Yeah.
it's not a bias remark, but more of a
Yeah.
policy remark that R&D portfolio pushing on renewable natural gas.
It's interesting, I had a couple of gas company executives come and visit me recently, and I think they would increasingly say, you bet, this is something we really ought to be looking in. Also, the PUC is entertaining looking at this and saying, in part for that reason and for other reasons as well, like safety and so forth, should we be putting a little bit more money into natural gas research? So I think it depends on who you talk to. There's others who would say, why waste our time on that? Let's focus over here on electric and hydrogen and just let natural gas sort of reduce itself over time. So I don't have strong opinions, but it's being debated right now. Alrighty, so again, this is just visual illustration. This is just one where I wanted to pull out. Data centers are one where we did research. We found, you can save a lot of money on your cooling if you do certain measures, and I think it's one that we had good results on and we're proud of. Storage is a thing we've been investing a lot of money into. Some people think it's a silver bullet that'll solve all problems. Others are a little less certain that's the solution, but it's certainly, if not silver bullet, silver buckshot, it's going to be part of it. As a consequence, we've been looking at storage. I spoke a couple months ago at Kaiser in Richmond, and it was fascinating. They put, I can't remember the size, but it was maybe 50, maybe 200 kilowatts on their fourth floor parking garage of solar. And then they've got it routed down to a series of batteries down in the basement, and they can island the hospital. And what better place, other than maybe a fire station or some other critical public service, than a hospital to do this? They can island and run the entire hospital basically forever. Now, they can't run everything, but they can get the operating room working just fine. The emergency rooms are fine. Maybe it's a little cold or hot in your room if you're stable, but not in imminent danger. So I thought that was really exciting. Cost a fortune, in today's dollars. But as I was talking to the developer, I said, what'd you learn as you were going through? He said, we were just constantly chasing. Prices were plummeting as we're going through the project. And at a certain point you commit and you've ordered something, and then 2 weeks later you read, they're offering the same thing and it's 30% less, and you sort of can't go back in time. So just doing these things, you don't get to the cheaper prices unless you do the slightly more expensive ones. So that's where our public funds can come in and help out. Hopefully we get enough of these going that the market takes off and we say, we're out of here. Good luck. We'll invest in other things that aren't quite there yet. And I think I've completely lost track of time, but that is my last slide, 42 slides. So if anyone has questions or comments, criticisms, they're all welcome. So officially, yes. Off the record, my personal view is I'm skeptical about it playing a significant role, and I say that based on the curves I showed for LEDs, solar, wind, batteries have all been trending down. If you put a curve up there looking at biomass costs of taking biomass and converting it into electricity, it just doesn't enjoy the same sort of downward trend that the others do. It's got, I think, a physics challenge. So we've been looking, though, all that said, and investing and trying to find places where it does make sense, where there's enough of a resource, where it makes sense to put a big investment in to try to convert that stuff into electricity or gas or something meaningful. And then the trick is, though, then you do that, now you got to get it somewhere. So if you're right near a nice substation or transmission line, great. If you're not, and you're wheeling, whether it's liquid fuel or gas fuel or whatever, you gotta move it, and it just gets, there's just a disconnect between source and need. I'm hopeful.
Proximity to the biomass. A lot of that available biomass is 20 miles from the nearest road.
Yeah, and getting it out's no party, and you also have people who argue that the forest did just fine before we got involved, and is it really, I mean, is removing this waste and this material that's clearly a source of potential big fires, is it really the best way to manage the resource holistically? I don't have the answers, but I think the questions are fascinating. You had your hand up?
Yeah, I was going to ask, what role do you think the CEC might play?
Oh, I think a big one. Yeah, we're, some of my bosses really think it's a key, and so pretty active. And there's legislation that's directing us to look a little more closely at it. Heat pump water heaters being one of the things that a Stern bill recently directs some deeper inquiries into. So I think it's got great promise.
Do you think that's a potential
I think so.
area? What do you think the levers are for?
I think Title 24 is a pretty good lever. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if it took the form of more of an incentive type approach going forward versus, mandating you got to choose one fuel source over another. Decisions that others far smarter than me will be making, but I think they're on the table.
As the whole energy system is changing, the role of the CEC is internally, what kind of changes is the CEC going to be doing to
That's a really good question. SB 100 has these ambitious goals, and we know, a lot of people know, well, there's some obvious things that are going to need to happen, and we're already working on those. They're a bit siloed, but not entirely. So we're setting up a team to kind of help look at shaping that, and what are going to be the areas that are going to need to be focused on the most. And then we're going to look at our organization. We're working with the Air Resources Board and Public Utilities Commission. It's not just us. And between us and others in state service, federal, local, and outside, universities, who can play what roles to try to make these things happen. I think we've done pretty well so far without a sort of cohesive focus on a really ambitious, fairly far out in the future goal. But these two things, SB 100 and the governor's executive order, are really driving us to say, we better figure out, do we need to change our institutions around? Do we need to make significant moves? So we'll see. I think right behind you. That's interesting. Yeah. Sure. Sure. Yeah, I mean, some policy decisions are made based on trying to provide the right incentives for the public to react and make decisions based on that. So some of those things you just talked about, LCFS, create incentives and hopefully drives behavior in positive ways, but it may make for an imprecise yardstick. Right. hmm Well, I think assuming if it grows back to the same level, but certainly temporally there's a disconnect. If we get huge fires and it takes a couple lifetimes to get them back to the sort of mass that contained that carbon again. Did you have your hand up? No. I saw somebody back there. Oh, no, I'm sorry, it was you. hmm Did you say 80? Yeah, yeah. Yeah, the last slide I showed with research, that's where our research folks are really looking closely. Because, yeah, lithium-ion is dominated. Some of you are probably aware of some of the challenges with it. There's limiting resources like lithium itself. It's not everywhere. It's not necessarily cheap to get out. We're looking in the south part of the state. There's some places where there's a big resource, but can you pull it out economically? Cobalt comes from parts of the world that it's a challenge to get it. It's limited. So yeah, that putting our eggs in one basket is not the goal. And when I toured the Tesla Gigafactory, they're also looking, thankfully, at other chemistries, and we're putting money and research into looking at what else is out there. There's a battery that was talked about recently, some articles, I think they were in the B, that had, I don't know where they are in the phase of in a lab versus actually working, but hold some promise for being not toxic, cheap, pretty good density. So yeah, we're looking at them all. Without permits, cheaper, right? Yeah. 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 Right. Yeah. We've got data that suggests there's a very high percentage of retrofits that are done without permits, and interestingly, one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you afterwards was quite selfish. I'm looking to put a new HVAC system in my house, and I'm considering a heat pump water heater. But interestingly, I got 4 or 5 bids, and every one of them had built into it, and nobody knew who I was. I don't think they go search people to see who it is. And they all had the HERS rating as a component of it. And so at least my little limited sample that I checked, it was pretty good. But those are belied by some of the stats we have statewide. So, there aren't great enforcement mechanisms right now, but there's a bill, AB 2424, I think it's called, of a couple years ago, and it directed us to look at what tools and techniques are out there to try to deal with the exact problem you described. And I think we're due by the end of the year to have our report published, and it's going to range from, there's a lot of different pieces. One of those we've looked at in the past is using tracking numbers. So if the manufacturers were required to put tracking numbers on, well, we could fairly readily see then on the back end, wait a minute, you sold 1,000 into California, but we only have permits pulled for 42, or whatever the number is. That's an approach. It's got lots of downsides, and it's debatable whether it's the right approach. So we're exploring how to deal with that.
Process, so there's a lot of discussion in CAISO among utility generators. We're going to see a lot of fossil closures as a result of renewables coming online and sort of price signals out there. that something that is kind of prominent in hyper right now? Is sort of sufficient electricity generation at the right time, the right location, and also this sort of related natural gas issues?
Yeah, I mean, we generally put it under the rubric of reliability, and I think, again, people probably 20 years ago would have thought, yeah, if you try to make a transition like this, it's gonna be catastrophic, and it hasn't been. Some challenges, particularly in some local areas, but yeah, it's a big part of the IPER. We're just now scoping the next one. It's gonna be a big part of it. So it's a constant challenge, but we have a division that sites power plants. So if it was decided 40 years ago that if we allowed local communities to make those decisions, we probably wouldn't have very many power plants because most local communities would think the neighboring community was a much better place to put it. And we're finding, though, that the number of applications we get is going down very low. In fact, where we have one that is going forward next Wednesday at our what we call our business meetings for about a 98 megawatt power plant in Stanton, California. But there aren't any more really on the horizon, natural gas-fired power plants. So yeah, increasingly we're going to have these integration challenges of intermittent resources trying to work in a system that doesn't want to be intermittent. So yeah, it's a constant challenge.
You know, a lot of the, all these regulations and measures are at CEC, they're all in California, but it kind of begs the question, if California's the only one rowing the boat, we're not going to get too far. So to what extent do you have allies or coalitions with other states that are, either educating them about our current policy or current findings, or working with them to also make sure that their standards get
Well, I think lead by example would be my first answer. And, we have seen folks take a look at what we do and emulate it. So that's a good thing. China just asked that our Title 24 get translated into China. About a year ago we did it. So now there's a Chinese version of it, and they're going to use it in different locales. One interesting thing is buildings are buildings and they're local, but with appliances what we find is when we say, all right, if you want to sell TVs in California, you've got to meet this standard. General Electric, Magnavox, I'm old school, I don't know, Zenith, I don't know what TVs are anymore, LG. They're usually, I would say most of the time, I don't have actual data on this, but most of the time they look and they say, well, do we want to retool our product to meet California's standard and then have one product line for California and have to figure out how to make sure those only go to California and then another product line for everyone else? And the answer is usually no. So then they retool their products so that everything's sold in the States, and oftentimes everything sold in the world is being manufactured to the California standard. So de facto, our appliance standards have a reach beyond California. And then I'd say finally, Andrew McAllister, our energy efficiency lead commissioner, is the head of a group called NASIO, which is the National Association of State Energy Organizations, offices, officials. Thank you. So he's preaching the gospel when he attends those meetings and runs them. So we're trying. Mm-hmm. Well, that's a good question. The potential is, I think, pretty high, and I don't think it's a nut we've cracked particularly effectively yet. So the building standards that require solar, there's a DR aspect to that where if we've enabled these homes to be smarter homes, the inverters are all required to be smart inverters. It doesn't mandate anything, but at least sets up the possibility that you could, particularly if you have storage, but even if not, modulate your usage so that you can time things a little differently than what would happen just naturally. But I don't think we've really tapped it anywhere near what the potential is. But we need people at the Energy Commission. This is my pitch to you guys all too. We need really smart, clever people who ask questions like that to help us. Because I don't think we've, as I say, despite its being at the top of the loading order, it's efficiency, renewables, then everything else. It's efficiency and DR, and I don't think we've given it as much of a focus. Sorry. Yeah, it's a good question. I think that's been one of the challenges with DR is if, depending on how you do it, you can have that need. But people talk about what if we could start at the appliance level, for example. You probably have heard these examples. What if your refrigerator, freezer could defrost at 3 in the morning when there's an abundance of cheap power, instead of doing it whenever the manufacturer set it to be, which is random, every whatever time period. How hard would that be? And it wouldn't worry. You wouldn't need to have anybody care about it. They just see a fridge and maybe it's a little cheaper, or it's got some label that suggests it's better by the environment. You have change in behavior. Everything I've talked about and what I think government does is either a carrot or a stick. So I talked about both. There are a number of sticks. You got to put solar on your house or you go to jail, right? It's a rule. But we could come up with better carrots that if the carrot's attractive enough, somebody's going to say, well, this is maybe strange and I don't really understand it, but I know I'm going to save on my bill. And it's happening. I mean, we're not doing it at all. But I don't think, again, we've really maximized it. Your hand up.
Yeah, I kind of want a related question to both of these. So the Energy Commission historically has been really focused on using energy time. There's some beneficial electrification. Up, down, right time. So how have you guys thought about integrating that into title 2024 analysis or other programs? Make that jump into really complex.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, we're working at the macro scale. We helped out with the regionalization efforts that have been going on and helping support Governor Brown, and he was really, really supportive of trying to do that. So we do that. This sounds very bureaucratic, but it's really more of a PUC thing. I think rates can have very motivational effect. SMUD, well, you guys wouldn't if you live here be in SMUD, but those of us who live in SMUD territory, they just announced they're going to be changing their rates dramatically. So, it used to be if you're going to run your washing machine or your dryer, you do it at the middle of the day. Now they're saying, no, we want you to do it, early, way early or late, and forget about the middle of the day. So it's happening in some places. We're doing, I think, more exploring, R&D, looking at appliances, looking at where our statutory authority gives us an in to try to deal with some of these things. But again, I'd say DR general is one where we got work to do. Ben. Yeah, immodest, I think. Sure. So I'll give you the 30-second whirlwind tour. I moved out here to go to law school. Went to law school a long time ago. And then worked for a big law firm for a couple of years, got an opportunity to go 7,000 miles that way and worked for a little country in the middle of the South Pacific. Stayed there 6 years, brought a wife back from there, ran a nonprofit where we sued polluters. And then one of my board members said, hey, Arnold asked me to be his EPA secretary. Do you want to come and be my chief of staff? And when people ask, God, how did you get that job? I said I knew somebody. I mean, it wasn't my great work or great body of whatever. I knew somebody. So I did that. We did it for a year. Governor Schwarzenegger was so enamored of what my friend Terry Tamminen, who was the EPA secretary at the time, who's still a dear friend of mine, was doing. He said, Terry, I want you to come over and be my chief of staff, in a heavy Austrian accent. And so Terry, I was driving with him one day, and we'd been at EPA for about a year. I thought doing great stuff on solar, energy efficiency, climate, and he said, guess what? Arnold asked me to come over and be his chief of staff, and I said, oh, great, congratulations, and you're going with me. So I moved over and then worked for Arnold for a year and a half, and then moved around to a couple of other agencies, and I've been at the Energy Commission now, I think next week will be 7 years. So that's been my history, and I found public service to be absolutely the most attractive thing I've ever done in work. They say if you love what you do, you'll never work a day in your life, and I think I've been pretty close to meeting that old yarn. So if you like public service, if you like the idea that you can try to make things better, whatever it is, healthcare or prisons or in my case energy, I think the state is a great place to do it, and I'm unabashedly biased that the Energy Commission is a terrific place to do it at. Our building's a little old and leaves a little bit to be desired, but aside from that, almost everything about the experience working at the Energy Commission is great. It's also really varied. So the folks that do research and work on those activities, that work day to day bears very little resemblance to what the energy efficiency people do on a daily basis, which then looks nothing like what the transportation folks are doing. So there's really a lot of opportunities. So if anyone's interested in an internship, we do them all the time. There's a super easy path, which is through Sac State. It's not the most lucrative way to go, but they've got what's called the Hornet Foundation. And you can go on and does everybody already know this? I mean, I won't bore you with it. All right, well, you can go online, you can build a little resume, their little form resume, which is basically just, who you are, load it up onto the system. All you have to be is a student, or you were a student very recently. I think you're allowed 6 months or something after you're no longer a student. Then you're in the database, and then you can see what jobs are out there for intern or student work. And I think the minimum pay, it ain't great, but it's like 13, 14 bucks an hour, and it might go to maybe 20. And then you can go look at what jobs are available and then try to match up. And we've gotten an endless number of students through that mechanism. So that's the sort of the easiest way because it's a set thing. And then it's easy for us because we don't have to, ordinarily when we have positions, we have to get the legislature to give us the authority to have a position for we have about 740 employees positions, and each one of those was granted to us by the legislature. These are different. These are kind of like contract work. We can go and do it directly. So to us, the Hornet Foundation at CSU is very attractive because it's just easy. That doesn't mean we can't do one-off internships and we can't, working through Ben or individually. If you've got a keen interest, you mentioned DR and you had an idea, there'd be something we could talk about. So we try to be very welcoming because we get a lot of things out of it. We get really good ideas. We get, some work value out of students who come. Frankly, I'm happy with it being a wash because we look at it as an opportunity to help folks in their careers. I was helped a lot as a younger person when people took the time out of their busy days to help me through things, and so we just think it's a good thing. But again, selfishly, we also get to find out it's a good stream of folks who want to then decide, some will say this isn't for me, I hate this, that's fine. Others will say, hey, this is great, and I might want to make a career out of this. So we've had a lot of students become some of our best folks. That's great for us. We like to think we do a pretty good job of providing a good experience for students as well. So by all means, consider it.
Past, like for electric resistance water heating, the state was very negative on electric now it's on a 180 flip on it. One of the things you got to be careful of, we as an organization is lose something to talk about human behavior and such. Here's an example. 2 years ago, because of the last heavy snow year we had, we rented a cabin in the Lake Tahoe area. And it was great. There was lots of snow and stuff. We were there. We rented it for a week. We were there for the first 3 days. An avalanche happened. Wiped out the main high tension wire for all of everybody up there without power. Now, this rental property, every time you change hands up there, they make you take out your wood-burning fireplace, put in another stoves require electricity. Fine as long as there was electricity. As soon as that power went out, I was in the middle of washing the dishes, and that instantaneous water stopped producing hot water instantaneously.
It's cold as quickly as it gets hot.
It was even worse for the space conditioning because the pellet stove was burning, but the power vent fan stopped, and the smoke of the remaining pellets that were still smoldering came into the house. So not only did we not have heat, we had to open all the doors and windows to get the smoke out. And we immediately brought it down to outside temperature.
Right.
And we couldn't see. We couldn't heat the house, we couldn't eat, we couldn't wash, and
Other than that, it was nice though, right?
So, we need to be careful when we mandate certain things happen or not happen, especially when decarbonization.
Mm-hmm.
We need to keep in mind that we need backups. People in the mountainous areas, there was no natural gas where we were. Suppose some people probably had propane. Some areas may have propane.
Yep.
But we need to be able to keep the customer, the user, be able to keep using when electricity is out.
Yep.
And we need to be cognizant of what it takes.
Good points. Good points. Now, if you'd had solar on that unit, at least during the middle of the day, it'd have been all right. And then storage as it gets cheaper. But yeah, these are not trivial concerns. I think near term it's all of the above, right? They each have different characteristics. Storage is, I think, probably today easier at the grid level, but it's quickly becoming, shifting. The other. Yeah, as prices come down, it makes more sense for people to do it. And people want to have the sort of security that if the power goes out, they've got a generator in the form of a battery that has no moving parts. So I think it's really sort of an all of the above thing. We'll see what happens. I think a lot of people think, the iPhoneization of the energy system isn't such a bad thing. So if over time it ended up we had less and less and less reliance on all the wires that can burn in fires and can have landslides knock them out and all sorts of things, maybe that's a good longer term solution. But we're sort of rushing headlong into it with a lot of challenges, and I think we've probably done a good job of not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good, and we're learning, there's a problem here. Let's make sure we deal with that and kind of trying our best with it. But I think it's going to be hopefully a good bit of both.
Out of time for questions.
Thanks for having me, guys. You bet. Give me this.
How's the roll?